all know that the Torah starts with the letter Beis. Bereshis bara Elokim. The question is why? Why not start with an Aleph? And there are many answers given, including the Chazal tell us that Beis stands for bracha, right? Because that's how the world was really built, to be a place of blessing. And honestly, my friends, when we look around the world sitting here in a time of mourning, of grief, of sorrow, looking at what the world has become over the last several months, emotionally, physically, medically, financially, spiritually, there's so much grief, there's so much pain. It's so hard to see the bracha. And so perhaps we could gain some perspective into the idea of Avas Chinam, of what it means to connect to another person by looking at the Beis as being a symbol of plurality, of what does it feel like for two people to have a connection, for me and my fellow, my friend, my children, my spouse, my neighbor, for us to have that connection, that Beis, that says that this is really what the world was created for, that perhaps we find bracha, we find Geulah in the very notion of being connected to another person. The Torah begins with the story of Adam and says, no. Lo tov heos Adam levado. It's not enough to just have one. Es elo ezer connected. We need to have a pair. There has to be the Beis. And then the Torah goes on to describe what does it look like to have ben Adam lechavero. As the Torah unfolds the story of Cain and Hevel, and we read of the destructive powers. What happens when you have two people that can't reconcile their differences, who don't see eye to eye? And so they're in conflict and they're in friction, and it gets to the point where Nebuch, one person, one brother, kills the other. Is that the Beis? Is that the bracha? Is that the connectedness? And the story unfolds again and again and again until we get to the Churban Bayis, the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, and then the second Beis HaMikdash. And where we are now is a place where we're waiting to rebuild, to redeem what that Beis is, to be able to take the notion of sinas chinam, of what it means for two people to have that destruction between them and perhaps replace it with connection. And I can tell you that as a marriage therapist, one of the things that I've seen before COVID-19 and even more so now is the level of pain that people are suffering, of what it means to have disconnect between husband and wife. And often the skills that I see that people are lacking in their ability to listen to one another, to care about each other, to communicate in an effective way, to honor the Beis, to feel that sense of we, of us, of connection. It becomes destructive beyond their marriage. But often those skills translate into the same way that they relate to a friend, to a neighbor, to another member of the community, to a colleague at work. And so how do we redeem that? How do we strengthen, perhaps even from a scientific perspective, the notion of what it means to create ahavas chinam? And so to do so, I'd like to talk a little bit about the science behind love. There's a scientific concept which is known as limerence. And limerence essentially is the launch of a new relationship. When two people come together and they describe this feeling of puppy love, and they say, oh, the birds are tweeting, and they hear the sounds and the colors, and the sky is bluer, and everything seems more vibrant. And the rest of the world around them looks at them and says, what are you crazy? Everything's still exactly the same. What is it that they are perceiving? And so scientists have studied what's happening chemically in the brain during this phase of limerence, where essentially oxytocin and dopamine start to be released into the brain. There's a sense of excitement. And an anthropologist by the name of Dr. Helen Fisher studied people's brains on love and put them in a functional MRI machine to be able to study what's happening in the brain, and actually discovered that the sense of high that they were getting, the parts of the brain that were lighting up, were similar to the same effect that we were seeing in people who were under the influence of crack cocaine. Right? In other words, the brain is flooded with all sorts of chemicals that gives them this initial launch, this excitement. And so you take a relationship where two people are strangers, and before long the two of them start to know each other, and they start to connect, and they start to talk, and before long they feel these chemicals. And the oxytocin tells them this feels wonderful. And so when they say the sky is bluer, they really perceive that. They hear the birds more than the next person because their senses are heightened. And what happens is that feeling begins to fade over the next 6 months, year, 2 years. And it's what people refer to as the honeymoon is over. And so whereas the relationship initially gets a strong boost to be able to send a couple soaring, they then have to rely on their actual communication skills. And that's what I help people with on a daily basis, to get them to remember what it feels like to listen to another person, to hear their pain, to think beyond themselves and have a deeper connection to the next person. Many people have experienced this feeling, this part of the brain. For instance, if you've gone to Disney World, right? There's a certain excitement that a person gets when you walk into Disney. There's a wonderment. There's a curiosity. There's mystery. There's a sense of feeling free. When you run through the park and you have a good time without a care in the world, that's the feeling of being so light, of feeling so excited. It's not a feeling that really translates well into the everyday life that we live, especially when things are busy and stressful and tense. But it's a feeling that we want to try to capture. The feeling of wonderment. The feeling of curiosity. If I look at my neighbor and all I can think is I know better than them. If I look at my wife and I say, well, I know what she's going to say anyway. Then there's no mystery. There's no curiosity. And then there's no dialogue. There's no conversation. There's no opportunity for two people to really engage with each other and try to better understand the other. But that's when we remind ourselves, the world doesn't see everything through my lens. You and I are going to see the world differently. Why? Because of family and culture and biology and hormones and experiences. Every person is going to see the world differently. So if I go through life and I expect that everyone's going to see things the way that I do, then there's no space to welcome another person. Then I grow resentful of people who don't see the world according to my perspective. That's where sinas chinam starts to creep in. Where we grow resentful of the other, of people who just don't see things the way that I do. What's wrong with them? How could they not understand? Well, they're not you. So inevitably there is going to be a difference. And the question therefore is there a way, scientifically speaking, to be able to change the way you feel about another person? To be able to foster and fuel and develop a sense of love, of ahava for another person? And so there's a world-renowned researcher, Dr. John Gottman, who is my mentor in the field of relationships. And he explains that there's a certain pattern wherein relationships evolve and develop, and it starts off with two people getting to know each other. He calls that love maps. First, I don't know you, and then I learn the map. I understand the direction that I have to follow in order to be able to get into your heart, to understand your mind. And that's simply a matter of conversation, of being curious. And we can do that with our spouse, our children, our neighbors, and our friends, or a stranger. We have an opportunity to look at another person and say, I don't know you, but I'd like to understand you better, even if, dare I say, I completely disagree with you. And that's what Dr. Gottman refers to as a concept called accepting influence, where I can look at you, I can hear your perspective, and I don't have to be threatened by the fact that we see the world differently. And too often I think we put up walls where we feel like it has to be my way. And if you're seeing things another way, then you must be wrong. And that makes me uncomfortable to hang out with somebody who's wrong. And so what we want to be able to do is change the way in which we proceed through the experience of love. So I first know you. And if I know you, the next level is I get to like you. I get to feel love towards you. But the issue here is that love is not born simply by the fact that I know you. I have to be able to go through a personal, deep, internal experience. And what that experience is an internal narrative. Okay, when you don't know someone and there's a void, so you start to fill in the blanks yourself. What do I think about that guy in shul who I see that I don't really know him? Do I like him or do I not? So that narrative of how you describe your relationship to that other person is going to be based on really how you see yourself. If you're wearing a pair of glasses and those glasses are dirty, then everything you're going to look at is going to seem dirty. Every person that you're going to look at is going to seem tainted. But that's not a din in the other person. That's a din in you. And so how do we clean those glasses? So there's a modality in therapy known as narrative therapy, comes up as well as in CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, where we have an opportunity to look at our internal model of how we see the world and to revisit it, to reframe it, and to be able to see the reality in a different light. It's very much what we would refer to as being dan l'kaf, to be able to look at a situation or a person and say, which way am I going to decide? Am I going to lean toward the positive or the negative? And Dr. Gottman found further in his research that for a relationship to be successful, there needs to be an overwhelming amount of positivity in the relationship. When he studied two groups of people, those who ended up ultimately getting divorced versus those who were successful and happily married, he found that the ones who ended up divorced had a ratio of 1-to-1, positive to negative. So if there was something negative that was said, it was yes, met with something positive. But it was just 1-to-1. And whereas we looked at those successful couples, Dr. Gottman found that they had a 20-to-1 ratio of positive to negative. Every one negative thing they said, they were able to come up with 20. You know how hard that is to come up with 20 positive things to say about your partner? And even when they were in conflict and actively involved in a fight, that ratio was still a 5-to-1 ratio. So we have to be able to see positive, and that starts internally. It's not a matter of sitting down with a person that you disagree with and saying, how can we work this out? That's a step later down the road. It starts off first with your own internal conversation. How do I talk to myself? When my spouse is going to sleep at night and I'm watching them in bed, falling asleep, I'm going to go through an internal narrative. Is my narrative going to be, oh, look at them, they're so lazy, they're going to sleep, they're so tired, and they don't have time to talk to me? Or is my narrative going to be positive and say, wow, look how peaceful they are. They work so hard. It's nice to see them getting sleep. They look so peaceful and so restful right now. We have the opportunity to frame things in positive or negative, and that becomes the beginning of the process of us being able to see the good in other people. One of the great optimists is Rav Kook, who, despite being a great optimist, really suffered some very severe, horrific tragedies in his life. He lost his young wife, who was only 22 years old. She left him with a baby. He then moved on, rebuilt his life, and Nebuch years later lost his 12-year-old daughter, who tragically fell down a flight of stairs and died. And he was sitting at the Shiva for his daughter, and he was so tzibrochen. And someone overheard the following words at that Shiva. The words were, instead of crying bitterly over the death of our daughter, we should remember gratefully that God gave us to her for 12 years to gladden our hearts. But what was amazing was, who was it that was saying these words? It was Rav Kook. But what was even more amazing is, who was he saying it to? They were words that were overheard, that he was mumbling to himself. He was working on his own internal dialogue. He was reframing a tragedy and saying, I can either look at it and I can be angry because it was all bad, or I can say, no, at least I had the great bracha of 12 years where she gladdened our hearts. That's the way in which we're able to look at things with a positive lens. And we can do that with every single interaction that we have. Choose to be positive, or we can choose to be negative. There's a beautiful, famous Gemara, and some of you may have come across it recently in Daf Yomi, in Shabbos Daf Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Beis, where the Gemara says, Tana Rabbanan, Hadan Chaveru lekavschus, Danano Solischus. If you judge another person toward the positive, so then you too are going to be judged by the heavens, lizchus, toward the positive, in the meritorious way. And the Gemara goes on to tell the story, Ma'aseh ba'adam echad sheyard megalil ha'elyon, a person who's up in the Galilee in the north, and he gets a job down in the south by a balabayas, and he contracts to work with him for 3 years. Erev Yom Kippur Amar Lo, and he comes from an Erev Yom Kippur, and he's ready to get his paycheck and go back home for Yantif. Tein li schari, ve'elech ba'ozunas ishti yuvanai. I want to get paid and go home to my family. And he says to him, the balabayas, Ein li ma'os, I'm sorry, I have no money. Okay. So this worker says, Tein li peros, you can pay me in produce. Amar Lo ein li, sorry, can't help you. Tein li karka, you can pay me in land. Ein li. Tein li behema, pay me in livestock. Ein li, I don't have any. Tein li kar muchsasos, you can give me some pillows, some cushions. Ein li. So what does this worker do? He's dejected, and he puts his stuff on his back, and he just returns home empty-handed. And then the Gemara says, La'achar haregel, after Yantif, Nata balabayas charo biyado, suddenly the balabayas collects all of this person's wages, and he loads up donkeys full of food and drink and all sorts of delicacies, and he goes up to the north and he travels to this person's home. And Amar Lo, and he says to him, I have to ask you, Bishashta Martili, when a few days ago, I told you, you said to me, Tein li schari, can you pay me? And I said to you, Ein li ma'os, I have no money. But mechashadtani, what in the world were you thinking about me? Amarti, shema prok matri bezul, nizdamna lecha. Maybe you happen to have had a really good business opportunity to buy cheap and you can sell high, and so you liquidated all of your assets, your cash, and you had nothing on hand. Okay. Uveshashta marta tainli behema, when you said to me, all right, go ahead and pay me in livestock, and I told you, ainli behema, I have none. But machashadtani, again, what did you suspect of me? And he answered him, Shema muskeres biad acherim. I thought maybe you just leased them out to other people. And when you asked me tainli karka, and I said I have no land, what did you suspect of me? Shema muskeres biad acherim. Maybe again, you leased it out to other people. Uveshashta marta lecha ainli peres, when I said to you, I have no fruits. But machashadtani, what did you suspect? Shema einan musaros. I thought, yeah, you have fruits, but they're not tithed, and so they're of no use. And when you said you had no pillows and cushions, what did you think of me? He says, well, maybe. Shema hiktish kol nechasav l'shamayim. Maybe you had taken all of your possessions and you had consecrated them as a gift to the heavens. And Amar Lo, at that moment, the Balabaya said, Ha'avod, I swear by the temple service, kachaya, that's exactly what happened. He said, I took all of my possessions and I sanctified them. And therefore, when I was able to be matir neder, I was able to then come to you. Just like you were able to give me the benefit of the doubt, Hashem should bless you to have the benefit of the doubt. It's an incredible, mind-boggling story. At every single turn, the worker had the opportunity to simply say, you cheated me, you lied to me, what's wrong with me? I can prove it that you have money or you have cattle. And yet, he was able to constantly look for the positive. That is a lens in which a person has that they look out upon the world and always try to see the good, to find the opportunity to see that people are complicated and life is complicated. My neighbor just has a different outlook than me. Can I be okay with that? Do I have to either try to convert them to my way of thinking, or can I just accept that people are going through their own experiences? People are different. There's a fascinating research study with a Swiss researcher in 1995, Klaus Wiedekind, who is famous for a study that's known as the sweaty t-shirt study, where basically he took a group of men and he had them wear a brand new t-shirt, an undershirt, for 2 days, and then he took those same undershirts and he gave them to a random group of women to smell. And his question was, when a woman smells that t-shirt, is she going to be drawn toward the scent of a man who shares a more similar DNA or someone more different? And people made an assumption that based on the rule of familiarity, I'm going to be drawn towards someone that I biologically, chemically can connect to. And what he found was actually the opposite, that people were drawn toward the more opposite on the spectrum that they were genetically from themselves. And the theory behind this is that we don't have to be similar. We don't have to think alike to be able to be compatible. And that goes in relationships, friendships, community relationships. It's okay for there to be differences. The brain, in that Disney kind of a way, craves the curiosity and the mystery if we can put our guard down and be open to understanding different ways of thinking. One of the great leaders of our generation was Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, Zechrono Livracha, the tzaddik who was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Mir Yeshiva, who the story is told that even though he was toward the end of his life, he was frail and sick, barely able to speak. So he would continue to learn every day and give shiur every day, and people would come to him for brachos. And about 10, 12 years ago, there's a group of Jewish businessmen who came from America to Israel. And someone said, you guys are here to tour the entrepreneurial side of the state of Israel. You should probably go meet the saintly rabbi. And so one of the businessmen on this trip happened to be a gentleman who was the CEO of Starbucks, a Jew by the name of Howard Schultz. And he was the first one to say, sure, I'm happy to go meet this rabbi. It sounds like an interesting experience that you only get in Israel. And so he, together with all these other titans of industry, come into this small conference room. And they're waiting, and they don't know the rabbi they're about to meet. But in walks this frail old man who's suffering from Parkinson's disease, who's weak. And Rav Finkel sits at the head of the table, and in a very soft voice, he looks around at these men worth billions of dollars. And he just looks at them simply and says the following: who can tell me what the lesson was in the Holocaust? And nobody knew what to say. And so he pointed to someone across the table and he said, "You, what's the answer?" So the person says, "Never forget." And the rabbi said, "No." And he panned the room again and he looks at these great giants and they're starting to schwitz in the presence of this tzaddik. And he called in another one. He says, "What's the lesson of the Holocaust?" And the person says that we should never again be bystanders. And Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel says, "No, you don't get it. The lesson of the Holocaust," he said, "is this. In the Holocaust, people were transported by cattle cars for 10, 20, sometimes 30 hours with no food, no drink, no bathroom. They were deprived of their humanity. And when they arrived at the camps, they were divided up, and those that were lucky enough to not be sent to their immediate deaths were sent to the barracks to suffer cold and freezing winter nights. And in their great cruelty, what the Nazis did was they would give a blanket out to 1 out of every 6 people that were heading into the barracks. And the person who received the blanket had a decision to make. In that frigid night, laying on the cold, hard, wooden bed, if you can call it that, would I wrap myself up and would I sleep through the pain of the experience and try to get a good night's sleep? Or would I unfold that blanket and share it with others? And Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel said, you want to know what the greatest lesson of the Holocaust was? It was that during the defining moments where people were suffering, where we were deprived of our humanity, that we found the greatest human spirit, because what we did was we opened that blanket and we extended it to 5 other people. And with that, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel stood up and he says, each and every one of you were blessed in life to have more than the next person. And the question that you have to ask yourself is, what are you going to do with the blanket you were blessed with? Are you able to open it up? Are you able to expand it and share it with other people? That's where Ahavas Chinam begins. To be able to say, I can be very different from my neighbor. I don't see the world as them. But that's okay. Because who are we at the end of the day? It comes down to that base, right? We share the connection with the other person. In 2011, I was zocha to donate a kidney to save the life of a stranger. And I wrote a book about it, The Kidney Donor's Journey, to be able to help inspire and educate other people about my experience, my challenge. And it wasn't an easy one, to think about whether I'd be willing to risk my life for somebody else. And I remember right before the surgery, I climbed up on the operating table and closed my eyes, and I said the following: Hineni muchan u'mezuman l'kayem mitzvahs aseh, shel v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. With this procedure, I'm fulfilling the biblical mitzvah, the mitzvah d'oraisa, of love your fellow as yourself. And this was a gift I was giving to a stranger. She was someone so different than I was. Right? I'm a man, she's a woman. I'm American, she's Israeli. I'm Ashkenazi, she's Sephardi. So what? So what? So why should we focus on the differences? Why should we focus on the things that separate us if we have an opportunity instead to look at the things that bind us, the things that connect us, to look at the commonalities that we share? So this is the opportunity today for us to clean those glasses that we wear and to, like Rav Kook, to look at the inner dialogue, to find the opportunity to be down l'kaf schus and see the good in other people, to self-talk when we see another person that's different than us and say there are qualities about them that I can love no matter what. It's a recipe for loving our spouses, our children, and it's also a recipe for being able to embrace all of Klal Yisrael. It's a recipe for Geulah. It's a recipe for us being able to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. And let me conclude with the following story. In 1944, there was a soldier in the U.S. Army named Captain Berman. He was a seasoned veteran, originally from New York. And just after the Holocaust, he was shipped to Germany, where he encountered the most horrific sights. And he and his battalions had the great schus of liberating several concentration camps. And among all the sights that he saw, things that would stay with him and would haunt him forever for the rest of his life, there was one particular event that he recalled that would forever stand out of his mind. And it was at one small but brutal labor camp where he encountered something that people almost never saw in the Holocaust. It was the sight of children. In this camp, there were about 50 kids ranging from age 7 to 12, and they were so skinny. They were like walking skeletons, barely any life left on them. And during the years of brutality that they suffered, they had cried all their last tears, to the point that they had nothing left within them. Their eyes had just gone dry. And when Captain Berman and his men saw these children, they wanted to bring them joy, and so they offered them some sweets, a little piece of chocolate, but the kids were so unaccustomed to eating food that their stomachs just rejected it. They couldn't enjoy anything they were given. And so the next day they decided, we're going to cook up a pot of hot soup, something that's warm and nutritious, and feed these children what they need. And Captain Berman walks in, and he was so amazed by the sight of what he saw that day. He sees 50 children lined up so quietly, so patiently. And each one was standing there holding a bowl and a spoon. And they waited patiently for their turn in line just to be able to eat something real. And as he looked around the room, he noticed that in the opposite corner there was one girl who was huddled up in the corner, sitting on the floor, with her eyes widely bulging from her small face. Her frail hands were trembling. She must have been 8 or 9 years old, but she looked like she was just 4 or 5. And he walked over to her and he bent down on one knee. And he said, "My dear, it's okay. You're safe now. All the bad people are gone. You're going to be fine. We're going to take care of you." And with that, suddenly her eyes began to well up with tears. Tears that were so overdue. Tears that she had fought back for so long. Tears that were waiting to be shed. And he gave her permission to cry. And she buried her face on his neck and she just wept. And he could feel her moist tears just pouring down his own neck, and he couldn't hold back his own tears. And he cried on her shoulders. And after several minutes of just hugging this girl, holding her, reminding her that she was safe and that it's okay to cry, supporting her, helping her feel loved, he lifted his head off of her shoulder. And the sight that greeted him literally took his breath away. Because what he saw was 50 young children with emaciated bodies, with expressionless faces, with dry eyes. But they were no longer standing in line waiting to get a bowl of hot soup. Instead, they were all lined up behind this girl, waiting patiently for their turn, so that they too could just get a hug. My friends, we have an opportunity to bring the Geulah. We do that through Avas Chinam. We do that through being able to look at the need of another person. And Nebuch, the way the world is today, there are so many needs, more than ever. And if we were blessed with more of a blanket than the next, let's share it with another person. Nosa ba'olam chaveru, let's ask, how can we alleviate the pain of another person? Let's have that inner dialogue with ourselves that reminds us of who we are, of what our values are, of what 2,000 years of Geulah has taught us about the desire that we have to return to Eretz Yisrael and to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. And please God, we should be zocheh to all receive that ultimate hug, to be brought together and see the binyan go al tzedek mehira v'yameinu. Amen.